Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream! Scream for your lives!
Hey weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cuppa. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today is here to tell us there is no pain, there is no law. Welcome, Graham Humphreys. How you doing, mate?
I'm very well, thank you very much.
You looking well with your plethora of Hammer posters behind you. Yes, yeah, very, very, very good. But it's lovely to see you. And now I had to do a quick check this morning, but yeah, you've been on before. You were my second ever guest on Tea for Terror. So you were in episode 2, you were on, and yeah, so and now we're on this is episode 44. So yeah, so yeah, we're hanging on. But it's good. It's really, really good to get you back on. I know you're really busy and stuff, so thanks for taking the time out to talk about this, the topic we'll introduce slightly later. So, what have you been up to?
Well, blimey, it's there's out and about, but mostly just work. I was just so busy at the moment, and I've been turning down work recently. And even this morning, I had reminder that I'd agreed to do a couple of jobs way back at the beginning of the year, and I've just not had the time to get around to them. I mean, they're not deadline driven jobs. These are private commissions, group commissions, which because they're not commercial, I can sort of, I guess juggle with the deadlines. There's a bit more freedom as regards when they need to be done. But I've got work through till May, probably June next year, and already I'm just panicking about how I'm going to get it all done. I mean, obviously it's a very good position to be in, but it's just the stress levels sort of increase slightly because I've got all the commercial work that has to be done, according to their own deadlines as well. So I'll be busy up until Christmas, and then working over Christmas probably, and then well into February with commercial work, and then I'll have to pay attention to some of the private commissions. But yeah, I'm very lucky in as much that I do get the work. But it'd be nice to have, a little bit of a break every now and again.
No, well, I mean, it is a good position to be in. I mean, so very often, I'm sure you've been through this yourself, but it's the opposite is not nice.
Oh yeah,
But,
I've been there. I've been there in the past.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it is not. I mean, I've always been with my sort of work. It's always like, I've always kind of gone with say yes and then figure it out later on. But having said that, I have got some discerning qualities. I'm not going to say yes to everybody if I don't like the thing, but yeah, usually if I'm into it, I'll say yes and worry about how I'm going to fit it in later on. Because it all works out in the end.
I do.
Well, you got to, don't you? Because it's like, freelancing. It's kind of, it's as I've said before, it's I'm busy. You have one day off. Jesus, I'm never going to work again.
Well, there is always that fear. So I guess that's one of the reasons why I do say yes to most of the work that comes in. And literally, I only turn down work if I know I literally cannot do it within a deadline. So there's no point in trying to squeeze in things if you can't do it properly. So I want to make sure everybody
exactly.
gets a decent job.
Mm. Yeah, so obviously you've got a real connection with the thing we're going to be talking about later on. But before we get to that specifically, there obviously the film we're going to talk about it's an H.G. Wells adaptation, and of which there have been many H.G. Wells adaptations. So, I mean, there's a couple of films we can chat about in more depth in a second, but I'm just wondering, just in more general terms, what's your kind of take on H.G. Wells as a kind of a writer, but also in terms of the concepts and how how particular adaptations have fared, and what do you have any favorites that come to mind, or because there have been notable and very unnotable sort of adaptations of his work. So I'm just wondering what your kind of take of the overall general kind of H.G. Wells as a screen concept works.
Well, I guess my introduction to H.G. Wells would have been when I was at school, the books in the library. I probably discovered his work when I was about 10 or 11, and would have probably read, I think, War of the Worlds, um, Dr. Moreau, um, Chrysalis, Breaking Wakes. I mean, all the sort of classic stuff. And I probably would have seen the 1950s War of the Worlds on TV at that point as well, although perhaps not some of the other adaptations. But I was aware of the fact that he was a revered writer of I guess science fiction, but it's one of those areas where you're kind of not too sure, is this, are we moving to the realms of horror, or is this indeed science fiction? And because of the era in which it was written, the books were written, um, that sort of cinematic tradition wasn't kind of established, and so defining the work was probably a little bit or less, urgent, I guess, in a way. I do know, for instance, among science fiction fans, um, that there's a very a marked difference between what they regard as science fiction and what makes something horror. But for myself, I've never um, really found that kind of fence, if you like, though, because the two sort of waver between each other constantly. And I think H.P. Lovecraft, is arguably both horror and science fiction, and I think H.G. Wells, straddles both of those worlds quite well. I mean, really, I guess it's when you get a film adaptation of something, then you probably can nuance the genre. For instance, the much later War of the Worlds adaptation with Tom Cruise kind of really does veer into horror, and whereas maybe the 50s version is probably more science fiction, where the book is actually placed really is really down to the reader, I guess. And I think probably this works for some of the other films. I mean, I think when you look at something like The Midwich Cuckoos, you can see how that's wavered into the sort of horror arena. Whereas, is it science fiction? I don't know. It's kind of one of those sort of undefined books, I think, really, which I don't know how to place it really. Um, but it's probably some social commentary in there as well. Um, but I do enjoy his work, and I think it is work of the time. But I think probably was had an eye to the future, which possibly some people haven't really considered certain areas. And I think that we can find relevance definitely today in some of his writing, which perhaps wouldn't have been so apparent at the time. And one of the things that it does interest me is where you kind of see the work that's gone before H.G. Wells, and I think particularly the film we're going to be talking about today, it is a good case in point, because there's a clear reference to a very major piece of work which was written 80 years before, so we can certainly talk about that in detail.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of H.G. Wells, I think it's interesting in terms of like the idea of it's is it horror, is it sci-fi, is it a bit of both? I think it's because as a culture now, we are, certainly from the sort of late 20th century onwards, we're kind of obsessed with labels and putting things. And of course, when H.G. Wells was, writing his most prolific, these terms didn't really exist in that sort of, because again, even going back even further, if you look at, obviously classic, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, that's very much a gothic horror stroke science fiction for a story, but yeah, so I think it's just I don't really, and I think really, I think it wasn't necessarily till we got, because I think science fiction in terms of literature, I think there is a much more sort of hardcore definition, but and there was a kind of split in the sort of late 40s, early 50s of the kind of hard science fiction and the more fantastical stuff. So you'd have like people like Ray Bradbury writing very human kind of stories, and then obviously Asimov's kind of coming at it from a very scientific point of view. But I think in terms of cinema, it was, I think that split came about on one level, just because it made more commercial sense. The idea of the gothic horror had really, lost its luster somewhere along the way in the 40s, and it become almost like a parody of itself with those kind of, well, it certainly was a parody itself if you look at the sort of the later sort of Abbott Costello meets whatever creature, kind of films, and those Universal films, how, despite the fact they started off as being very surreal and very sort of subversive, by the time you get to the end of the 40s, they just kind of throw not good films, interesting films, funny, but they are not as subversive as they once were. So obviously you're going to push the more certainly when the Cold War kicks in, you're talking about those kind of atomic sort of issues and those monsters, and it's but I would class those films again, films like them. They are horror films. They might be using a science fiction angle, but they are horror films effectively. They are monster movies, and monster movies are horror films to me.
Yeah, and I think it's I think if you enjoy um, films which are either science fiction, horror. I think that, in terms of cinema experience, both are um, equally enjoyed. And I think it's really when it comes down to literature, I think the people are going to be a little bit more specific. But I just love cinema anyway, and I think anything which tackles something which is a sort of a metaphor, if you like, or allegorical, which has sort of fantasy element. And when I say fantasy, I mean that could be anything from the gothic through to the scientific. It works for me equally.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really read H.G. Wells till I was probably in my late 20s when I read H.G. Wells, so it wasn't a school thing. Um, but I'd always been aware of his work through the film adaptation. So, like yourself, I saw the George Powell version of War of the Worlds fairly early on when I was a kid. But around the same time, the biggest influence of H.G. Wells by a roundabout way was, the Jeff Love Orchestra, that double album, that and the accompanying illustrations and which was obviously other than it being a musical, it's very faithful to the Wells book, and I just fell in love with that idea of, what's become known since as kind of steampunk, this kind of Victoriana science fiction horror. And those brilliant illustrations in the book I've got, which I managed to track down I found it in a charity shop actually. I got a double album, so I've got the booklet and everything. So it's yeah, that was kind of my first instance. But obviously, a little bit later, um, it was also, James Whale's The Invisible Man. And also I remember possibly saw this before the James Whale version. There was a 70s BBC, possibly early 80s, late 70s series, The Invisible Man, which I thought was really interesting when I didn't quite follow it in the same way because it was quite adult, but I remember watching that at the time. So yeah, but I guess in terms of more more relevant to what we're going to be talking about, the film we're going to be discussing later, we've kind of got to talk a little bit about two preceding sort of adaptations of the Island of Dr. Moreau. So we have, first of all, there is Island of Lost Souls from 1932, and then later on we get the Island of Dr. Moreau from 1977. I mean, there had been before the Island of Lost Souls, there had been a kind of short, silent version of Island of Dr. Moreau, which I've never seen. I think it's been lost, or most of it's been lost. But it's, from what I understand, it played out more like a comedy sort of. So I don't know how successful or unsuccessful that was because I've never seen it. But yeah, certainly Island of Lost Souls to start with, Earl C. Kenton is, you know, I would argue that that is a perfect example of a pre-code film. There is something, and it was banned for 30 years in this country. And, even when it was shown in places in America, depending on which kind of state or which region you were in, you might have seen a different version because there were cuts. Um, and it is still very strong stuff, I think, and it is very unsettling and very uncomfortable. And some of those makeup jobs, Wally Westmore's makeup jobs, and that they are incredible. And even when I've got this sort of the Eureka sort of version of it, and there are all sorts of extras on that, but there are kind of stills of unused makeups, and they look amazing. It's just an incredible, very disturbing, very subversive film, considering what was just around the corner, what was actually happening in Europe at that time, and what was just around the corner for everybody else. This idea of the Nazis and their camps and their experiments and things like that. It's very, very on the nose, but terrifyingly so.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting when a film um, is able to address either directly or indirectly um, something that's going on, quite serious in the world, and once again using the word allegorical or metaphorical. I mean, I think the Island of Lost Souls certainly had a lot to say or to be influenced by at that moment in time. And yeah, I agree. It is still quite a shocking film in many ways. I mean, I think that there's a very nasty streak at the core of it, and I think Moreau's intentions are quite upsetting in many ways. I mean, he's trying to basically pair off a human and an animal together. It's just just not a very nice idea, really. But also, it's just the character, the portrayal by Charles Lawson. He's fantastic in that portrayal as well. It's just such a sleazebag, and but you're right about those makeup effects. They are quite extraordinary, and I look at them now and I just think that they're still working. I think that I don't look at them and think these are just pathetic rubber masks. I mean, they're actually you get a hint of some of the Universal monster movies there. I mean, there's definitely a lot of Wolfman going on in there, and of course you have Bela Lugosi who's playing one of the creatures, and no stranger to obviously the horror genre himself. Um, uh, but yeah, I wasn't aware of the silent film that you're talking about, and I'm glad that you said it was probably lost because that means I've got the excuse not to have seen it. And yeah, so yeah, it's the Island of Lost films, clearly. But yeah, the Island of Lost Souls is one of those great films which it kind of sort of seems to be under the radar for a lot of people. I always felt, and I didn't get to see the film for the first time until the 1980s, and it appeared on a very strange double bill, if I seem to remember rightly. I think I saw it the screen on Baker Street, and it was double billed with something quite peculiar, which might have been something like Young Frankenstein. I mean, just it's some sort of very weird, inappropriate combination. But I do remember it looking quite interesting as well. I mean, the set design is quite marvelous. I love that the fact the House of Pain is like some sort of Art Deco pod, and obviously the very exotic jungle setting, very popular in the 1930s, of course, and King Kong probably led the way for that whole interest, I guess. So in sort of these exotic, you know, vine-strewn, giant-leaved environments, and I mean, Island of Lost Souls has this extraordinary garden, which what appears to have giant asparagus sprouting up everywhere, which looks great. I mean, it's like mutant plants, and I guess the suggestion being that Moreau's not merely playing around with humans and animals; he's actually, playing around with nature itself in all of its forms.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, like I said, the makeup effect. I think the reason I mean, the makeups work. Wally Westmore, him and his brothers were all kind of involved in sort of makeup design, but they work, I think, in the same way. They are unnerving, I think, on some levels because I think in in a similar way to Freaks, from the same year you have, even though you've got people like Bela Lugosi and other actors in those kind of makeups, I think on dotted around the edges, you've got people who had maybe some sort of facial deformity or, differently abled or whatever, and they're kind of in makeup. So it has this kind of eerie sort of feel that so it gives this impression that there is the experiments that have been going on have had real consequences. It's not, it's not this idea, like you said, like the Wolfman. I love Lon Chaney Jr. I love the Wolfman, but I never really get away from the fact he looks like a teddy bear. It's never really been scary, but there is something deeply disturbing, and because it's like Freaks, I think. Obviously you've got the action going on in the center of Freaks and the center of Island of Lost Souls, but it's those little glimpses. There are characters in Freaks in one shot where in Freaks where I think it's when Madame Tetralani is kind of she's in the sort of forest and she comes across two hunters who are aghast at these kind of strange people that she's with, and it's never even referred to, but there's a little like childlike character who's like covered in fur and is just crawling on the floor. And it's never referred to ever again. And it's just like, what's that? What's going on? And I think it's the similar thing with Island of Lost Souls to a slightly lesser degree, but it's kind of like watching it again and again. You pick up on these. Oh, the, what's that? Who's that? Where's this cat? And especially the scene towards the beginning where they're on the boat, they've not even got to the island, but we're introduced to some of these characters on the edges, and we just get to see glimpses of them through the fog. It's brilliantly done.
You're convinced that the thing on this table isn't human?
Its cries are human.
Do you know what it is, what I began with?
No.
An animal.
So, what about, okay, so we move on a few years. So what about the 77 version? Because I mean, I didn't watch it. I think I must have seen it in the early 80s when it came on television, and I've seen it a few times since, and obviously more recently. But what's your impression of that? Not because I don't think it's anywhere near as successful. There's some good elements, I think, but it's a difficult one in some ways, I think.
Well, it seems to take a different direction to Island of the Lost Souls, and clearly they wanted to make big of the prosthetics, the makeup, which probably takes some. I mean, if you think about TV series Planet of the Apes, I mean, with the sort of movable snouts that you can see some of that going on, and it's interesting. Of course, this is we're looking at the same kind of era as Star Wars as well. So there's some big budget stuff going on there, which is science fiction, but of course all those big budgets were aiming for outer space, and this is kind of going back to sort of science fiction of the sort of Victorian era, and that's why I thought it was kind of sort of out of place in many ways. And I did not go to the cinema to see it at the time. I would have been at art college and was otherwise distracted by other things anyway, then and music and sort of some of the other interesting films coming out. It seemed to me that it was almost like a TV movie, which kind of just was just coming out, in the wrong decade, perhaps even. And also the casting didn't seem particularly contemporary either, though. Really, and I would view it very well. I have viewed it very differently now because I saw it for the very first time yesterday. To my shame, it's one of those films which was, always on my list of essentials, if you like, especially knowing Island of Lost Souls very well and having done my own work with Richard Stanley's interpretation. And I know that Richard referred to the 77 version quite often, and I'm for some reason I never saw it. And actually, having watched it now, I can see Richard's interpretation is very much informed by the 77 version, and particularly the idea of Moreau in the form of the 77 version, Burt Lancaster's interpretation. I mean, he's riding a horse around the jungle, and there's no way Marlon Brando was ever going to get on a horse. But that's all casting detail, really, I suppose. But I did enjoy it, and I know it was good seeing some very good actors being very sincere about what they were doing as well. The Beast people were given very definite personalities, and you got a sense that there was I mean, I thought the makeup effects were interesting because they're actually quite simple in many ways. Very sort of simply drawn, if you like, and probably less complex looking than the Island of Lost Souls in many ways. I mean, almost looking just like rubber masks. But I think their simplicity is really part of their joy because you get a very well defined sense of this is like a buffalo, this is a hyena, this is a bear. You really can tell which animal is going on there rather than a sort of hybrid chimera type of creature, which you kind of get more of, I think, in Richard's I say Richard's film, but we'll get into why it isn't his film. But and I think Island of Lost Souls, I think you don't necessarily get a sense of what animals these necessarily are. They're kind of generally
they're more kind of generic sort of
whiskers.
beastmen, aren't they? And beastmen and women, aren't they? I think you get like you can see on the edges like there are these kind of pig men. You can obviously that they're more obvious, but yeah, I think you're right. I think that I don't know, the 77. I don't want to be too. I don't. I try and defend any film. I'm not going to completely slight. I mean, I remember the Lost Soul documentary, and I know Richard talked about the 77 version because he liked the Island of Lost Souls, even though it wasn't really faithful to the book. But he, I think he says he was really angry when he came out of the 77 version. So it didn't necessarily make me angry, but yeah, I think it suffers a little bit because I think it came at in an era that sort of early to mid 70s sort of era where they were trying to redo these kind of horror classics, because obviously you'd had the sort of sex and blood of Hammer, you'd had the gothic romanticized, or all these kind of versions in the 30s, and then there were these very literal, very literary sort of versions that came out in the 70s, and I think some of them worked really well. So obviously, year 79 Dracula was great, I think, and the early 70s Frankenstein the True Story, I think works really well, even though they're not technically that faithful to the books. They felt more like period dramas that had some horror trappings rather than the other way round. And I think that's what this feels like to me. It feels like that, and I think some of it's successful, but I just don't. There's not enough to dig your teeth into. I think it just falls a little bit flat. It doesn't have the same shocks as Island of Lost Souls, and it doesn't have the same kind of gothic, slightly camp quality either. So it doesn't, and it doesn't do the kind of serious-minded stuff um, to the right degree either. So it kind of somewhere it gets lost. I think it was a really interesting attempt. And like I said, I don't really want to get into a position where I'm slagging something off. A lot of people are involved in that. I think Burt Lancaster's great. I think, um, and I remember when I saw it as a kid, I remember enjoying it. I think now though, I'm slightly more discerning, and I don't think it necessarily works as well as it could, but it's okay. It's okay.
I mean, I guess, we were talking about those adaptations from the 70s, and I guess one of the interesting things is that they are, ensemble pieces. I mean, they've gone for, well-regarded actors who have very good, proven track record, and they're kind of star-billing names, I guess, though, and so that's kind of in part driving what was hoped, I guess, would be their popularity. I mean, we talked about Frankenstein: The True Story. I mean, it's an amazing cast, and you kind of that the film has its merits purely just on those names alone. And I really did enjoy Frankenstein: The True Story. It's it really stayed with me. I watched it in its I think two or three parts on TV at the time, and was just quite disturbed by it in a good kind of way, I guess. And I just remember it looking quite beautiful as well, and just really enjoying some very unusual set decisions and costume decisions as well. And so I guess I can see how the Dr. Moreau 77 version was kind of straddling a sort of the 1930s Universal genre through to something which was more contemporary. And I guess you do get a hint of the more modern science within, and I can see how that kind of definitely would have influenced Richard Stanley's version as well. There's definitely an attempt. Really, before, I don't think that the whole science of DNA had really been developed quite so much at the time, and so we probably the idea of gene splicing would probably not have been something that would have been written into a film at the time. But it's definitely trying to play a contemporary card, but with sort of, I guess, historical material.
Yeah, 'cause, I mean, obviously, if you think about it for more than 10 seconds, it is very silly, but it manages to have this gravitas. It feels like that whoever wrote it or the characters are speaking, and all that. To be fair, Michael York is always value for money, and he takes it very seriously. Whatever he thought about it after he'd walked off set, I don't know, but I believe him in that role, and same with Lancaster as well. So I think if you've never seen it, kids, then definitely go and watch Island of Lost Souls if you've never seen that. But yeah, I think the 77 version is worth checking out. It's only like an hour and a half long. I think it's out there. You can watch it for free on various streaming sites or whatever.
Oh yes, it was in particular towards the end of the film, you just get an incredible shot of the burning house, and it's kind of framed by an avenue of undergrowth, and just this kind of it's a gateway to Moreau's compound, and you just see Moreau's body hanging from almost like a gibbet, with this kind of hellish, fiery background. I mean, it's just a really arresting image. That probably is one of the little standout moments, I think, which he's also that his body is hoisted up also at the gates as well by Michael York's character, as the sort of it's almost like a sort of religious moment. He's saying that he's not dead. He can see you. He's here. So the law still stands. You must obey him, and just hauls up his corpse for the animals, the beast people to see, as if they're going to be convinced by this kind of lifeless figure. But there was a nice little touch, I thought, and but yeah, that shot of the of Moreau's corpse just hanging in front of the inferno is very striking, I think.
Yeah, it has some really nice, interesting moments, I think, and I think that it does work really well, and I think it's interesting because obviously there is with a lot of these kind of H.G. Wells, Island of Dr. Moreau adaptations, and not even direct adaptations, but I think that the influence goes on all the way through. I mean, you can see, obviously, I don't want to get too much into this because it's kind of a different topic, but obviously there's that connection between Joseph Conrad and H.G. Wells, and H.G. Wells having a bit of a beef with Conrad because he saw Conrad as nicking his idea, and obviously Apocalypse Now, it becomes an adaptation of Conrad, but there's very definitely sort of Moreau elements of in Apocalypse Now, and obviously you've got I'm not the first to say this, obviously lots of people have talked about this, but obviously you've got Brando in two different versions of that similar sort of story, and obviously Brando being connected to two versions where the production was notoriously shit, so you've got all that. So but also on a more kind of like on the periphery, if you think about those kind of late 70s, early 80s zombies films like Zombie Flesh Eaters, I mean, that as soon as they get to the island, then it's it might be zombies and not man beasts, but it's definitely Moreau. And even something like Zombie Holocaust, which was kind of like another rip-off of Zombie Flesh Eaters with a few cannibals thrown in. I mean, again, they even up the stakes with the Moreau stuff on that, and I think all of those films, so whichever version of so whether it's a 77 version of Dr. Moreau, or it's Zombie Flesh Eaters, or Zombie Apocalypse, or even Island of Lost Souls, they all end in this kind of inferno on the island. They all end up in sort of characters being burnt to death or whatever. So I think that idea of the island and these creatures on this island that we're not quite even in, you even see bits of it in Kong, I guess, really, this idea of an island and strange things going on there that we are not used to seeing, or we can't quite appreciate or comprehend. So I think that runs through a lot of cinema.
Andrew Braddock, shipwrecked and cast away on a land beyond human experience. A world inhabited by sounds and shadows. The island of Dr. Moreau.
Okay, I think it's about time to introduce the main film. So the film we're going to look at today is the 1996 version of Island of Dr. Moreau, which began as a Richard Stanley project and ended with John Frankenheimer finishing off the directing duties.
On the sixth day, God created man. On the seventh day, he rested. And on the eighth day, in the year 2010, in a remote laboratory, an exiled scientist created something impossible. Unmistakably human. Undeniably animal. On the island of Dr. Moreau.
Now, obviously, this is slightly different because obviously you had a direct involvement in the film, Graham. So, do you want to tell us how you kind of got involved with the project and what that sort of process was like?
Well, yeah, so I'd worked with Richard on the film Hardware and then Dust Devil, essentially storyboarding, I guess, but with also a few production drawings or paintings, giving a sort of a kind of perspective view of how the film might look and what settings might look like and how characters might appear in the film. With Dr. Moreau, I think I'd had a sort of meeting with Richard. He talked about, the script, his initial script, and was looking to take the script to America with view to finding the backing to get the film made. And so he proposed that we created initially a script cover, and his choice of Moreau, I think it was understood at the time, was Jürgen Prochnow, who had I think Richard was really impressed by his performance in Das Boot, and that was his first choice. And so we created a cover which was in part this idea of the character, almost Burt Lancaster's interpretation of Moreau, but also we were looking at Fitzcarraldo as well as a kind of an inspiration, again with the jungle setting and this kind of guy in this kind of colonial jungle get-up, who's very much a master of his environment, and you can see the parallels there actually with Fitzcarraldo and Moreau. So we had this idea of this kind of almost like Fitzcarraldo type character, and with a sort of host of beast people at his feet. He's reading from a book, and I guess it's almost like a sort of a biblical idea going on. I mean, he looks a bit like Moses, preaching, and so I guess there is a sort of religious element to that. And in fact, we decided to proceed with a series of illustrations which were key moments in the film. And Richard actually, I think, described them as almost like being stations of the cross. And so we the very first one we did was an image of Moreau delivering the mutant baby, and with the sort of the surgical light behind his head, almost like a halo, and he's literally almost like the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus in his hand, with the sort of adoring shepherds and kings in the background, who are just basically the dogmen in a surgical scrubs. And I think at that point there's also going to be a slight Lovecraftian element as well. I think it was imagined there'd be a giant tank with a kind of tentacled creature kind of moving around in the background. And there was another scene where the Moreau is arriving in the village, the Beast People village, and they're literally laying palms in front of his horse. It's like Jesus arriving in Nazareth and being greeted by the crowds. Another scene has Moreau after his death being paraded by the sort of mourning Beast People, and he's kind of like a crucified Jesus, basically. So there were all these little ideas there, which were as I said, stations of the cross, or stations of Dr. Moreau, and a lot of the ideas, initial concepts, which never made it into the final film, and really kind of not hugely present sometimes in the script that Richard finally delivered, I believe, either. We had some very psychedelic stuff going on there as well. I mean, I think at one point, Montgomery, he's kind of basically holding a beach party, and all the beast people have been given, acid, and they're all drinking as well. And there's a beach orgy going on, and it's kind of very much something out of like a sort of 1970s a psychedelic movie. And scene with the kind of hyenas, a grouping of hyenas of beast people with machine guns destroying the lab, which kind of, I think one of those little reference points was also American Werewolf in London, with the sort of stormtroopers invading the home in that kind of dream sequence. So that was one sort of extra kind of very clear reference. But we produced these 12 illustrations, including a scene or two scenes which were never really, which never made it into the final film as a concept, where Project returns to civilization, having been rescued from the island, and it is interrogated by some, I guess, psychologists who's trying to ascertain whether he's just gone mad in what he's describing. And his mind has become slightly unhinged, and he's just basically viewing the world as a world of beast people. And so the interviewers are kind of pictured as giant vultures, literally giant vultures. And then we had a street scene, New York street scene, where everybody's an animal of some sort. So yeah, there were elements which we never made it into the film, and which were quite expansive, and certainly took it out of the H.G. Wells historical setting into something completely different.
I mean, we'll discuss the '96 version of what the film became in the end under sort of John Frankenheimer's helming, if you like. But certainly, I think what kind of fans, particularly fans of Richard's and Richard Stanley's, what they were excited about was having, lots of people who had seen Dust Devil and seen Hardware were kind of excited about that. And then when it became kind of someone else's project, and we'll talk about that later, but I think what most fans get excited about is what could have been. And I think, and I'm not saying this to blow smoke up your arse, but I do mean this. I think that those images you created, they were they were kind of like the illustrative image version of a dangling carrot. I mean, they look like that looks like it could have been such an incredible film under Richard Stanley and those kind of ideas, because it's clear that whatever people think about Richard Stanley, he's not short of ideas, is he? He's kind of, he's bursting with this kind of, and he kind of, from what I understand when I've seen him and stuff, he's very, very much bursting with his ideas, and he has a very unique way of looking at the world and getting his ideas across. And I think whatever this film ended up being, we didn't get that. And it's always that thing of the thing we haven't got. Like there are numerous examples of films that were never made, or versions of a film which were never made. And I think that is, so your images, I think, which are beautiful, they're brilliantly done, and I think they are these tantalizing glimpses of something that never was, and that's kind of really exciting in a way, I think, but also disappointing, obviously, because we didn't get that version.
Yeah, I think the vision was, I used the word psychedelic, and I think it kind of was psychedelic, really. There's, I think, clearly a lot of drug taking going on in the film. There's written into it was a cannabis plantation right in front of the compound, and that was one of the first things to go, really, when it kind of came to the final production. So I think the idea that the beast people were kind of stoned constantly was quite an interesting one. But yeah, there was a lot. There was so much stuff that obviously was erased from the final production, and it's just incredible what could have been. And I think, and in part, that was down to the fact that the budget had soared, obviously, into the millions through the casting of Marlon Brando. I think had it been a lower budget film, I think with low budgets you're forced to be more creative, in what you do to make things work, and you get more leeway, I think, in content as well. So I think we could have had something nearer to those original paintings had Brando not got involved, but then perhaps without his involvement, maybe the film would never have actually come to fruition at all. It's very hard to say, really. But certainly casting was one of the critical elements of Richard's film, which where it's making and its downfall as well. We can certainly talk about a couple of the actors. I mean, we know David Thewlis was very much a last minute drafting. Original options. The original cast was going to include Bruce Willis at one point and Rob Morrow, and it's just the idea that I think Val Kilmer was kind of one of the original considerations, but for the Prondick character rather than Montgomery, and he didn't want to play that character because he didn't like the name Prondick. This is what I was told anyway.
Well, I think that okay. I don't want to kind of dwell on the Lost Soul document. It's a brilliant documentary. I would recommend anybody to watch it if you want to kind of see how a potentially incredible production can just crumble away, and see how a production can get just go from one thing to being something completely different. And if you want to see what can go wrong with a production, then watch that documentary. It's brilliant. But not only that, it's not in a kind of let's watch it so we can have a laugh at this. It's not that. I don't mean that. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the documentary is that it is very much it's championing Richard Stanley, and I think that's what the underline that. I think that's the really good thing about the documentary. But also the other thing about a documentary, which is made, and I get this, you can't do a 5-hour documentary, you've got to edit it down. So I don't know how much kind of stuff was left on the cutting room floor, but I think, like you said there, with the casting, I mean, because what gets overshadows, and it's possibly because he didn't want to have anything to do with the documentary, are people like David Thewlis. I mean, David Thewlis, maybe, obviously he went on to do things like Fargo and stuff like that. I mean, at that point, for me, I mean, part of the attraction, other than the fact that it was H.G. Wells and all this kind of stuff, part of the attraction for me when I first saw it in the video shop, was the fact that it got David Thewlis in, because I'd seen Naked and just thought that this at that point it was like, this is the best actor I've ever seen. It's just incredible, so it's a shame that he kind of gets overlooked on the documentary. Really, they don't really mention him at all, and I don't know whether there were specific reasons for that. And also, the other thing on the documentary, they make big play of the fact that obviously Brando was up to his usual tricks, being bit of a cheeky man, but also as well, he was he was grieving as well. There's all that kind of stuff. He'd recently suffered this loss or whatever. But also, it's largely sort of most people would kind of that were interviewed in that documentary kind of refer to the fact that the Val Kilmer was being a bit of a prick. However, I got to say, I've been rewatched it again the other day. I I think Val Kilmer's brilliant in it. Whatever he was like in real life and whatever he was going on the set, that's one thing. But actually, I think his character and the way he portrays that, particularly when he's kind of aping Marlon Brando towards the end when he's pretending to be Moreau, I think it's a really good performance from Val Kilmer. I mean, he is kind of he's partly channeling a psychopath and partly channeling sort of Jim Morrison, but he's kind of all of these things are going in there. I don't, because it kind of I think the documentary in some ways makes you think that he's kind of phoning it in. I don't think he is. I think he might be awkward on set, but I think he's good in it.
Yeah, I think that's probably part of the gift of editing as well, to an
Yeah,
extent.
yeah.
I mean, we know that Marlon Brando didn't want to learn his lines. He had an earpiece, so they'd be fed to him. I think famously, no, this is probably just David Thewlis just extrapolating, but he said that literally he was getting his lines through an earpiece and would just repeat what he was hearing, and because of the frequency used, that he was picking up police messages occasionally as well, just basically repeating, And I think the line that was given was, "Oh, there's been a robbery in Woolworths," or something like that. But yeah, and I think Val probably knew the lines, but just sometimes just didn't want to say them and just would make things up anyway. Though, but I agree. Watching it again this morning, in fact, you can see that Val Kilmer did actually give a lot of consideration to the character, and he created a character with what the material he had, and it's interesting also his character within the film really is the downfall of the island, and it's just interesting that he's the downfall of the film in many ways, and then also his character is the downfall of the island within the story. And watching the film, it's interesting to what you think you've seen, and then what you when you re-watch what you actually are seeing, and what how your viewpoint shifts along with the characters. It's very hard sometimes to find out to actually define who the central character is, whose story we're looking at. I mean, it's called The Island Dr. Moreau, but to be honest, Moreau is really almost like a background character. And he's dispatched midway through the film, it feels like, and he's not very active at all, because I mean partly it's Marlon Brando, who isn't a very active person at this point, because he's a very heavy man and just can't move around. You rarely see him standing; usually he's just sitting. But then you have Feruza Balk's, cat girl sort of story as well. She's well, I think she gets referred to as a real pussycat by Val Kilmer's character, which I think a great little line as well, disparaging, but at the same time actually telling us actually she's actually a cat. And certainly towards the end of the film, when she's trying to escape essentially dogs, she actually runs up the curtain. It's almost comical, really. But what I did realize was that it's the hyena man who seems to be quite central to the whole story. It's almost like his awareness of his animal state and trying to get away from that, at the same time acknowledging it, and his relationship with Moreau, Montgomery, and the other animals as well. I mean, he's kind of literally heartbroken when his best animal friend is animal's best friend, man's best friend, is killed, and he discovers the little pain-making device in the cremated remains, and that sets off the chain of events, which brings it all to sort of a terrible climax. But yeah, it's interesting how his character is given a lot of dimension, and that's probably in part down to the actor playing him as well, who with only his eyes really and his body movements has to bring a whole range of emotions to that character. And of course, very sadly, the actor did pass away shortly after making the film as well, which is not very tragic. I mean, he's only about 30 years old, I think, but clearly somebody with a huge talent to make somebody without the use of a face actually acting. It kind of reminds me of almost Vincent Price in Dr. Phibes. He's kind of his face isn't able to move because it's supposed to be just like this kind of prosthetic thing he's wearing, so he can't express anything at all within the character itself. and has to use his eyes on everything, and it's just then his voice and the delivery of the lines, which give you the character. And I think it's the same with the hyena man, who really is the central character ultimately throughout the whole film.
It's I mean, watching because this film, again, partly due to the documentary, but it has been. I think it's been slightly unfairly derided, and I think clearly it's not Richard Stanley's vision, and that's what we wanted. But but again, I think what the other thing the documentary, I'm not saying they do it on purpose, but it almost presents John Frankenheimer as a bad guy. And it's like, oh fucking hell, it's John Frankenheimer. He's a brilliant director, And he was brought in at the last minute to try and herd this whole island of cats, if you like, and other animals. But that's basically what he was doing. And so, yeah, I know, and I'm sure there were clashes on set, and I'm sure he had a job to do, and he was trying to be as pragmatic, and maybe he rubbed people up the wrong way, and maybe people had taken a lot of drugs, and maybe they'd been on this island for too long, and maybe they were sick of the weather, and maybe they were sick of the production changes, and the cast changes, and the script changes. So I'm sure everybody was in a bad mood. But bottom line is, John Frankenheimer is incredible. It's Seconds is, we've covered Seconds on this podcast, and it's one of my favorite films. It's just what a brilliant director. So I think it did bring something. I think it's very, this film, I think this film has a lot going for it. Um, but it kind of suffers from from how lots of films would suffer if you lost a director, if you had a change in cast, if you had a script change, if you had all these kind of production problems, if you had the amount of studio interference, if you had a director being parachuted in at the last minute, obviously it's going to suffer. But I think within that, there are lots of elements which work really well. I would say the first act is probably the strongest, and I think it's got some of the best images, and I think possibly the first act retains some of those more Richard Stanley elements, I think. I think that there are some brilliant. Even Brando, who is absolutely phoning it in, but he's probably the one actor in the world that can phone it in, and it still looks pretty fucking good, I really like his laissez-faire sort of Dr. Moreau. It's a brilliant kind of version of that evil scientist who doesn't realize he's the bad guy. I think he does see them as his children, and he is kind of slightly warped, and he's been away from reality too long to actually understand that the world works differently. He's kind of like the Nazi scientists that were working on the US kind of space program. They've kind of almost forgotten that they were on the evil side, and they're kind of so focused on their work. It's that kind of. He doesn't. Obviously with someone like in Island of Lost Souls, it's very much a mustache twiddling sort of villain, and that's not really what you get with Brando in this. I mean, he's not in it enough, I don't think, but I think when he's on screen, he is kind of interesting and slightly disturbing. And then you've got his kind of shadow, which is the Val Kilmer character. So I think all the performances are great. I think there's some brilliant set pieces. I think the creatures look good. It's kind of, I mean, I don't mind it, but it's kind of it's in that. I mean, obviously we'd had Jurassic Park, but this is kind of much lower budget. So, but it's kind of in that sweet spot before CG just became to dominate everything. So there's this very much a live action kind of piece, and I think a lot of it works incredibly well. However, it's like looking, for want of a better sort of metaphor, it's kind of like looking at a jigsaw puzzle where all the pieces look brilliant and all the kind of pieces are really interesting, but then we've not quite fitted them together. It kind of lacks that in some way. It doesn't feel like it just doesn't gel. It doesn't come together as it should do, I think. And I don't know what it is. I think you're perfect. I think you're absolutely right in saying that it is a kind of, it feels like an ensemble piece, but it's very difficult to know where our sympathies should lie. And that's okay, but it kind of, I don't know. There should be some sort of emphasis, whether it's Moreau or whatever, and just don't really have that. So I think it works well on a lot of levels, and I'm not going to slag it off at all. But I do think this is what happens when there's that much interference, And I think you kind of see this. This is kind of held up as being a bit of a disaster of a production. Yeah, in terms of physicality and things like that. But I think that you get the idea of that studio interference and changing things and chopping things up. I think this happens all the time now. I think, a lot of your big end kind of Disney productions, they're just kind of focus group to death. They're algorithms. It's kind of, they're made by rote, and it's not, so at least there was a vision behind this, and I think some of that vision comes in, and I think John Frankenheimer does a good job of keeping some of that together. Yeah, is the finished film? We'll never know what Richard's film would have been, but it's not this. But I don't think, given the amount of problems they had to face, I think what they produced in the end, it's worth seeing. It definitely is worth watching.
Well, I think the one of the issues was the huge investment of money, which meant that you couldn't just abandon the project. I mean, there's just too much had been committed to this film at this point, and the fact is, all these people were, all this talent, they were in Cairns. They were the other side of the world from where they normally exist, and as were crew members, makeup people, etc. So I mean, the investment was massive. I mean, the set builds alone were. I mean, I remember going to the house, the compound, Moreau's house, which had been literally built as a house, so they could actually use the rooms within as well. So there's like one massive set, really, a real set, and it was, quite substantial, and it just looked like a real house. And of course, they did burn it down as well, of course, ultimately as well. So that's all done, on screen. It's not a miniature or anything like that at all. But I understand what you're saying about it being like a jigsaw. Well, the glue for that jigsaw would have been Richard's subversive elements, which were woven throughout the whole film. And without those, it kind of just does become like a series of set pieces, and with a few bits of exposition in between. I think you're right about Frankenheimer. I think that probably he's one of the few people that could have actually come in and saved that film because of his experience, and his experience in particular with handling stars as well, egos, if you like, and just being able to whip the whole thing into shape. It probably needed somebody who could treat it like a business, rather than just a creative project. And watching the film this morning again, I was just, actually, it's quite a beautiful film. I mean, all the color palettes are quite intense, and it didn't kind of achieve the levels of psychedelia that I'm sure that Richard had brought in, but it's a good looking film. I mean, that's partly because the sets are real. They're substantial sets, and you've got real jungle. This is not stage work at all. It's actually all shot on location, pretty much. And all the set dressing is there. I do know there were some visual details which were significantly changed. For instance, the Beast People, particularly the servants in the house. And it's the original idea was, and this, we're talking about color again, is that the dogmen, the servants, were all going to be. It was like the idea was that I guess that dogs are attracted by kind of colourful things and stuff, and given the chance to actually choose their own outfits, opted for really loud Hawaiian shirts and sort of ghastly big 70s kipper ties. That was the original wardrobe that was planned for them. And when Richard was removed from the project and Frankenheimer took over, he obviously was aghast at this idea and gave them the very formal kind of evening dress and kind of chef uniforms, etc. But I do have in my possession one of the ghastly ties that was very kindly sent by the costume keeper or designer, Norman Moreau, which I do occasionally wear. Yeah, it's just that you can see how in that as an instance how different the look of the film is from what it could have been. It's a very simple thing, but it would have made a huge difference. And also, did you spot the Daleks in a film?
No, Daleks.
The film has Daleks. It's in the scene where they're dining in the evening. There's a salt and pepper shaker, and they are little Dalek salt and pepper shakers.
Nice.
I have no idea whose idea that was, but it's a little stroke of genius.
So, any last thoughts about the film then?
Well, apart from what it could have been, what it isn't, I just don't think it's quite the car crash that everybody assumes it is. And I think we've discussed that Val Kilmer probably isn't as bad on screen as he might have been behaving off screen, but nobody does a bad job within the film, I don't think. And it looks fantastic. The makeup effects, for what they were, I think, perfectly good. I think there's a tiny little bit of CGI, very basic, early CGI, which is the leopard man leaping around. But it's hardly there really. Though most of it's just very, very practical stuff. But yeah, you could see that there would have been a lot more for the eye to behold had Richard sat at the helm. I know that also in the theatrical version, I think we're missing the fight on the dinghy at the beginning as well, which we have a shark attack, which I mean, who would want to remove a shark attack from a film? It's a really important part, and also it sets the scene. It's quite bloody, and kind of it puts it thoroughly into horror territory from the outset. Promises, violence and chaos, which kind of does ensue. And I just don't understand why that was removed, really. But it's just one of those things, I guess. It's available on the director's cut, and
it is, yeah.
I've got a German Blu-ray, and it's certainly there. I think all that was missing was about 4 minutes. And you think, well, why would you trim 4 minutes from a film, really? But yeah, crazy. So yeah, I enjoyed watching the film again, and I think I can see there are little hints of the film that would have been. Some scenes do seem to remain intact, as regards Richard's own script. I can remember storyboarding some of those scenes that we do see in the film. The casting is just one of those weird things. Who knows what the film would have been, with different casting. It's in the air as to what would have happened, really. But I think the film's well worth the watch, and it's interesting to compare it with the 77 version as well. Two completely different things, but it's interesting just seeing how Richard's film is an extension of the 77 version, and yet completely different to the Charles Laughton 30s version. I did want to just make one little observation as well. We mentioned Frankenstein earlier on, which was written 80 years before H.G. Wells' novel. And one of my favourite Frankenstein films of the Hammer cycle is The Monster from Hell. And for me, Frankenstein, The Monster from Hell and The Island of Dr. Moreau are so closely created. I mean, Frankenstein is almost like the Moreau character, and his island is the asylum. And, he's kind of created this beast person. It's so alike in its themes, and I've always kind of quite enjoyed it for that reason.
Well, it just remains for me to say thank you, Graham, for coming on. Been lovely to see you again.
Good to see you.
Remember to call round next time. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.